Hello, and welcome to The Lord and the Rings. This is it, the final session. You've made it this far. You are so close to being done listening to my annoying voice. Could I go on speaking more and more and more? Of course I could. I could ramble on and on and on, but I think I've already done that enough. And so today we've hit our final lesson. And I have saved my favorite lesson for last. Maybe that was a foolish idea. Maybe I should have started with this one, but I am really excited for this one. It's my favorite subject. I've tried to save the best for last, and I think it's an idea that really connects all the other ideas that we've talked about during this small group. So, to begin today, I want to talk a little bit about myself. And normally I don't like doing that. I have in the past in the small group, but normally I try to avoid that somewhat. But today I want to talk a little bit about my experience with The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien. So, a question that you might ask is, why do I love these books? Why do The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, so on and so on, why do these mean so much to me? I have read many other fantasy books. I have read many good fantasy books written by incredibly talented individuals who have really honed their craft and made some amazing works. But none of them have grabbed me the same way that Tolkien's writings have. And I think if you asked me that at different points in my life, I would have given you different answers. Oh, I love the characters and the themes. Oh, I love the history of the world and how detailed everything is. And those things are certainly true. But today I want to focus on one that I've come to appreciate more and more as I've gotten older. And so I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience, how I got into the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. First, whenever I was in 5th grade, my uncle loaned me his copy of The Hobbit. And boy, did he have no idea what he was going to start by doing that. Once I finished The Hobbit, I rented a set of CDs. Actually, I don't even think they were CDs. I think they were cassettes because I'm older than I'd like to admit now. But a set of cassettes that contained a recorded performance of The Lord of the Rings. And I listened, and I got about halfway through The Two Towers before it was time to return the cassettes to the library because I just didn't have the time to listen to all of it before it was time to return it. And there was somebody else waiting on it, so I didn't get to just immediately turn around and check out the cassettes again. So then, during the summer between my 5th and 6th grade, I went to a bookstore that is unfortunately now out of business, but I have had a lot of childhood memories at that bookstore. But I bought the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings box set that contains all 4 books. And during that summer, I read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. And then I finished with The Return of the King as 6th grade was starting. And then I read The Silmarillion and The Children of Hurin during my 6th grade year. Probably not a great idea. The Children of Hurin is probably not a book that a 6th grader should be reading. It's a little on the darker, more serious side, but that's beside the point because I really, really loved these books. I really loved the world that they created. And as I was reading them and as I watched the movies around this time in my life, and as I was experiencing them, there was something a bit different about them. Something that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but there was something that set them slightly apart from other series that I had read. And I couldn't quite put it into words back then. And then 2 years later, whenever I was in 8th grade, I decided to do a little bit of a reread of my Tolkien books, and I did the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings back to back to back, and seeing kind of the whole history of Middle-earth kind of laid out beginning to end just amazed me. And that was whenever I went from loving the books to really being obsessed with them in the way that I am today. And it was really during that second reading that I started to understand what felt different to me, what it was that was setting apart the Lord of the Rings and the connected stories to all the other stories I had experienced, all the other books I had read. And really, it can be summed up in a quote from Aragorn. At one point during the story, Aragorn is leading the hobbits from Bree to Rivendell. It's just Aragorn and our 4 hobbits. And the hobbits are kind of freaked out. They're being hunted by the Nazgul, by the Ringwraiths. And they feel that impending doom coming ever closer. And so to provide them some distraction and a little bit of comfort, Aragorn decides to tell them a little bit of a story. And before he starts telling the story, he says the following: "It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts." And I think that's what really separates the Lord of the Rings. All the tales of Middle-earth are sad, yet it may lift up your hearts. You see, I think that there is a common misconception about the Lord of the Rings when comparing it to other fantasy media. And that common misconception is really a simple one. Lord of the Rings is often viewed, I think, as the happy fantasy story, the one where good wins, where good triumphs over evil. And yes, that is true, but I think that it's more complex than that. My pastor said that I couldn't include anything on this Bible study that I couldn't include at church, and so I blurred out one of the images of a darker fantasy series. So if you can still recognize it after I blurred it, I'm sorry to tell you that you are a horrible sinner. I hope it's apparent that I was joking. But I feel like whenever The Lord of the Rings gets compared to other series, some people want to dismiss it a little bit as not being as serious or as dark. They say that it doesn't have as much death, or it doesn't have adult situations, or doesn't swear constantly. But I think that that really misses the point. One, if somebody says that Lord of the Rings doesn't have enough death or sadness, I'm like, have you read the Silmarillion? You've got like a major character dying like every 5 pages. But more than that, I think that Tolkien uses sadness and sorrow in a very profound way. That he had a theological and philosophic view of sorrow that makes his use of the concept deeper and more fulfilling to read. It strikes me deeper than any other work of fiction has with its sorrow. And so, today we're going to be talking about sorrow. In the past, during the early sessions, we talked about the fall, our fallen nature and how we can fall. These are related concepts, sorrow and the fall. Sorrow is a result of the fall. So we might tread some similar ground, but this is going to be a slightly different lesson. We're going to cover some slightly different topics, or some topics in a slightly different way. But as we go through, I want us to remember, in one of his letters, Tolkien writes, "There cannot be any story without a fall. All stories are ultimately about the fall, at least not for human minds as we know them and have them." Tolkien says that because of our fallen minds, because we are fallen and imperfect, we can't understand a story or a world without a fall. And so I want us to remember as we go through that we're going to be talking about some difficult things, perhaps. And we are limited in our understanding of the world, of sorrow, of God's plan. And sometimes that limited understanding that we have can get in the way of us fully realizing how great God is even in our sorrow. So I want to keep this in the back of our mind, that we are fallen, and therefore we don't have a perfect view of everything. We can't see everything exactly how it is from God's perspective. And so to begin, I want to start by summarizing the creation story of Middle-earth. Some of you have heard this before if you've been at previous sessions, but I want to reiterate it just to kind of refresh it in our minds, or if you're somehow tuning in to the very last one and only the very last session, just so that you know where we're at. So Tolkien has a mythology, and as part of that mythology, he wrote a creation story. And whenever he was writing a creation story, he didn't just want to rewrite Genesis. He didn't want to just copy it with just like a couple details or names changed. To him, Genesis was already the perfect version of Genesis. And so his version of the story is a fictionalized version. So there are details that are not completely in line with the Bible, because it's supposed to be a work of fiction. But in the beginning, there was God. And God created a bunch of spirits to live with him in heaven. And God took the spirits one by one or in small groups, and he taught them how to sing. And then once everybody knew how to sing, how to make music, God gathered them together and he said, okay, I have written a great composition, a great musical theme that I want you to perform before me. And while performing this theme, I've put in little bits where you can improv, bits where you can add your own little flair, your own little invention into the song. But you need to follow my general direction. I've laid out the general direction, so follow that. So the song starts, and initially it is following the direction of God. It is following his composition. But then one of the spirits who is part of the choir decides that he doesn't want to just be another member of the choir. He doesn't just want to be another face in the crowd. He doesn't want to be secondary to God. He wants to be in control. And that spirit would later become known as Morgoth. He was originally called Melkor, but he would later become known as Morgoth, and so that's how I'm going to refer to him. And so Morgoth starts singing a new song, a song that is in opposition to God's song. And some of the spirits who are around him start to follow Morgoth's lead, start to harmonize with Morgoth. Some of the other spirits become confused and they don't know who to follow, and so they start making mistakes, and suddenly there's a great discord, there's a great cacophony in heaven. And so God stands up and takes direct control of the song, and suddenly Morgoth's song is battling God's song, and God's song is victorious. And then God reveals that the song is more than just a song, that he is going to take what it was and give it physical form, that he is going to turn it into the world. And that includes all the little additions, the little improvisations that the spirits made while singing it. And so God shows them a vision of the world. But because Morgoth tried to take over, he introduced negative elements to the world. He introduced violent elements to the world. And later Morgoth would work to corrupt the world, to corrupt God's creation, to bring them to ruin to make them fall morally. And so from the very beginning, there was some sadness, even in the creation of the world, because of Morgoth, because of him causing confusion in the song. In fact, Tolkien writes, "The sound of mourning was woven into the themes of the world before it began." The sounds of mourning are a critical part of Middle-earth. They're there from the beginning, or even from before the beginning. They were a critical part. And so today we're going to focus on sorrow. And I have 3 broad points that I want to focus on. And so the first part is that sorrow can lead to pity. To explore this idea, we're going to look at a spirit who stayed loyal to God. And her name was Nienna. Nienna came down to earth to do God's will in the world. And Tolkien writes about Nienna and what her temperament was, what her attitude towards the rest of the world was. Nienna is acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that the world has suffered in the marring of Morgoth. So great was her sorrow as the music unfolded that her song turned to lamentation long before its end, and the sound of mourning was woven into the themes of the world before it began. That ending part should sound pretty familiar because we read it just a few slides ago. But Nienna saw the evil that Morgoth was starting to weave into his song, the violence, the troubles, and she started to sing sad songs, lamentations, because she was sad at what Morgoth was doing. And so some of her lamentations entered into the world. And so not only was there violence, but there was sorrow. But Nienna does not weep for herself, and those who hearken to her learn pity and endurance and hope. She brings strength to the spirit and turns sorrow to wisdom. So at first it sounds like, oh, Nienna, you messed up. You wove sorrow into the world. But the sorrow that she weaves into the world isn't useless. No, the sorrow that she specifically added to the world is a sorrow that brings pity, that brings endurance and hope, that turns sadness to wisdom. Morgoth introduced pain and suffering through his music, but Nienna introduced a sorrow that learns from the pain that Morgoth introduced. And then we hear about a certain wizard whenever he was much younger. But Gandalf's ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. And I love the image on the left that shows Nienna, and kind of weird, but a young Gandalf, and we don't really have a description of Gandalf before he arrived in Middle-earth, at least not a physical description. So there's some artist interpretation going on, but I kind of like the kind of saintly image. I think Nienna kind of reminds me of depictions of Mary in Catholic imagery. But Gandalf went to Nienna and he learned from her, and from her he learned pity and patience. Things that he would need whenever he would go to Middle-earth and have to fight Sauron many years later during the events of the Lord of the Rings. And last week, we talked about pity. We talked about mercy and compassion. And so I don't want to hammer this too hard. I don't want to read a ton of passages, but think back to Frodo. Think back to the conversation that Gandalf had with Frodo, saying that the pity that Bilbo showed Gollum would be important, that it would rule the fate of many. And so Gandalf, who learned pity from Nienna, then imparts to Frodo the importance of pity. And at first Frodo doesn't understand But then whenever he sees Gollum, he suddenly feels pity for this creature. And I think part of the reason is because the pain and struggle of carrying the ring weighed heavily on Frodo's heart as he went further and further on. And so he began to experience the things that Gollum had experienced while in possession of the ring. He began to understand Gollum better, and that made it easier for Frodo to feel pity. You see, pain, sorrow, loss, they can do a lot of things to us. They inevitably change us. And sometimes they make us bitter. They make us angry. They make us more likely to lash out at the world, to cause others the pain that we are feeling. But sometimes sorrow can cause pity. Whenever we feel pain, if we combine that with empathy, with understanding, then it can lead us to be more compassionate. We say, I feel so bad because of what happened to me. I don't want anybody else to feel this bad, so I am going to do my best to help others. I am going to do my best to be empathetic and understanding towards them. I am going to do better. So sorrow can either make us a worse person or a better person. It depends on how we choose to proceed from the sorrow, how we choose to grow. And it's not a one or the other. It's not a you make your choice once and then you're decided for life. No, we have to constantly make that choice over and over again. How are we going to respond to sorrow? Are we going to let it make us bitter, or are we going to make us more empathetic, more understanding, more loving, more Christ-like? I read this verse during the previous lesson, but I really like this passage of Scripture. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And I think I made the joke last week that I feel like I've said the word comfort so many times that it ceased to have any meaning. But God comforts us in our afflictions and our sorrows. But that's not where the verse ends. That's not where it ends. We are then supposed to go out and comfort others. We are supposed to have pity on those who are in afflictions. We are supposed to take our sorrow and our pain and be comforted by God, to receive understanding and love from God. And then we are supposed to go out and do that to other people. We are supposed to show them love and comfort and pity and mercy. And so sorrow is never fun. I know that that's a radical statement, but we can still use it for a positive outcome. We can still use it to grow and become more caring and kind people. And so the second thing I want to say about sorrow as it pertains to Tolkien's writings is that a central theme of Tolkien's mythology is the idea of fading. And I've gone on record as saying that I wasn't a huge fan of the way the Rings of Power TV show talked about the fading of the elves. I think that they used a lot of language that was close, but they changed it in just enough ways where it didn't really have the heart of Tolkien's writings in it. But that's a tangent for another day. Because fading and decline are very prominent themes in Tolkien's work. And we see that on, first, a societal level. And so, to begin, I want to focus on the elves. Whenever we go back into ancient elven history, many of the elves were living in peace and bliss. in the west with the spirits who had remained loyal to God. But some of the elves decide to rebel against the spirits, to go back to Middle-earth. They leave the bliss and the peace that they were initially in. And when they get back to Middle-earth, they construct kingdoms and palaces and strongholds, and they try to make it as nice as the places that they left in the West. They try to recreate that bliss and that beauty. But it doesn't last. Their strongholds, their kingdoms are destroyed and laid to ruin. And then the elves in the Second Age, they start to rebuild. They try to rebuild their power. But it never gets quite as nice, quite as grand as what came before it. And there's this constant struggle with the elves of them building something and then losing it and then trying to rebuild it and not quite getting quite to the same quality as before, and then that being lost. And then whenever we get to the Lord of the Rings, they just have a few places left where they dwell, and they are not living in a location that is anywhere near what they started out in. A song that the dwarves wrote says the following. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away. The world was fair in Durin's day. The world was fair. It was fair. When was it fair? Before the fall of the kings of Nargothrond and Gondolin. Nargothrond and Gondolin are two of the elvish kingdoms that were made. This poem, this section of the poem is saying that the world was fair back before the fall of the elven kingdoms of old. But those kingdoms did fall. And now the elves have lost a lot of their power, a lot of their influence. Hold on to this little stanza of poem, because now I want to talk about the dwarves. The dwarves built mountain kingdoms, and the greatest of their kingdoms was Khazad-dûm. But even though Khazad-dûm lasted for centuries and centuries, it lasted a long, long time. But it didn't last forever. Eventually the dwarves dug too greedily and too deep, and they awoke a Balrog that destroyed their kingdom. Greatest of all the mansion of the dwarves was Khazad-dûm. It was the greatest, but then it fell. And the dwarves constantly want to reclaim it. They want to build kingdoms that recapture its glory. But the greatest of their mansions fell. And that poem talks about this. This is the same poem as before. The world is gray, the mountains old, the forge's fire is ashen cold. No harp is rung, no hammer falls, the darkness dwells in Durin's halls. The shadow lies upon his tomb in Moria and Khazad-dûm. It's talking about how the forge's fire is cold. Nobody's forging. Nobody is making music. Nobody is smithing. Things that are associated with dwarves. The halls are empty. They are abandoned because it has been lost. Their kingdom was lost. And so think back to that first stanza that I read. The world was fair. It was fair back in the ancient days. But now the world is gray. Something has been lost. Some beauty and magic has left the world. And now things aren't as nice as they once were. And men aren't left out of this. The greatest human society in Tolkien's mythology is Numenor. specifically Numenor as it started out. But over time, Numenor starts to degrade. It starts to decline. Its people become restless and they start doing bad things. And then eventually some of their people are exiled from Numenor. Elendil and his sons after founded kingdoms in Middle-earth, and though their lore and craft was but an echo of that which had been in Numenor, yet very great it seemed. Elendil and his sons are the leaders of the exiles of Numenor, and they come to Middle-earth and they establish kingdoms, Arnor and Gondor, and their kingdoms seem great and powerful. But it's only an echo of what was in Numenor. It's only a reflection of what was in Numenor. And so there's this constant trend that I mentioned earlier in Middle-earth's history, where societies will build something great in their ancient days, and then they'll lose it. And then they'll build back in memory. They'll build back echoes or reflections of that first great society. And they'll make a good society, but it's still not as great or as wondrous as what came before. And then they'll lose that. And then rebuild, but it's not as great as before. And so on and so forth. And so there's a trend downward in Middle-earth history. There is beauty and there is magic lost. In fact, that's one of the key ideas of Tolkien's mythology. The first age is filled with magic. The second age has less magic than the first age. The third age has less magic and less beauty than the second age. And so on and so forth. And eventually, the world is going to lose a lot of its magic until it becomes the mundane world that we know today, the world without magic. And though magic can be misused, it can also bring about great beauty. And so something has been lost. Something is always being lost. And I think that this is very different from most of the high fantasy stories that I've read. Most high fantasy stories are about old things returning. If you look at, say, I'll use Star Wars, even though that's has some science fiction aesthetics. It has a lot of fantasy elements. The original trilogy is about the Jedi returning through Luke. And the sequel trilogy is about the Jedi returning through Rey. And the prequels are about the Sith coming back and the Jedi falling. But you can have the original trilogy without the prequels. But you can't really have the prequels without the original trilogy, because the main focus of the overall story is about the return of the Jedi Order, return of this old thing that has been lost. And I think that that's very indicative of a lot of fantasy literature. The dragons were once gone, but now they are returning. Things like that are very prominent in high fantasy stories. But in contrast, Tolkien's mythology is about the fading and loss of magic and beauty within the world. It is about old things fading away. And I know what your initial thoughts might be. How can you say that? The Lord of the Rings is about the return of Sauron, the return of the ring. The third entry is even called the Return of the King. Well, for Sauron, I want to say, yes, he returned and he announced himself as the Dark Lord. But his influence never really went away. Even after he was defeated and the ring taken from him and he lost his physical form at the end of the Second Age, he was still influencing the world all the time that he was just a spirit out there reconstituting himself. He was still influencing the orcs and some of the men who had allied themselves with him, he was still pitting them against Gondor and against his other enemies. He was still influencing the world, and so even though he does return in The Lord of the Rings, he never really left the world completely. He was still having an effect on it. And as for Aragorn's return, that's because in The Lord of the Rings we are at one of those peaks, one of those rebuilding phases. Aragorn's return signals a boost to Gondor. It recaptures some of its former greatness. In fact, Minas Tirith is made more beautiful than it has ever been. But it's still not as great as Numenor. And one day it's going to fall too. We're at the peak now, at the end of the Return of the King. But we're going to have a decline. And I think Tolkien recognized this. Very interestingly, Tolkien started a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. And he got less than a chapter actually finished. And he decided never to publish it. And never to finish it. And I've seen this work called The New Shadow, and it doesn't actually exist, but this is some fan art of what the cover might have looked like if it ever were completed and published. But Tolkien writes about that story, and he says, I did begin a story placed about 100 years after the downfall of Sauron, but it proved both sinister and depressing. Since we are dealing with men, it is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable feature of their nature, their quick satiety with good, so that the people of Gondor in times of peace, justice, and prosperity would become discontented and restless. I found that even so early there was an outcrop of revolutionary plots about a center of secret satanistic religion. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would be just that. Not worth doing. Tolkien says that it was sinister and depressing, and I don't know what exactly was going on in Tolkien's mind. I can only go off of his writings and some speculations, and I've seen kind of two ideas about why he decided to abandon that story. And one of them was, it's really depressing that Gondor so quickly after Sauron's downfall immediately turned to evil. Like, Aragorn rules as king of Gondor for a long time. He lives longer than an ordinary man. So this story would be set like in Aragorn's son's time. Like one generation after Aragorn, Gondor is already starting to fall. It's already going through a moral fall. And so even if the plot, the evil, was defeated, it would still be kind of depressing that it is already so quickly beginning to fade, that we are so quickly going on that next step in the downward trend. And then there's the elves. I've talked about them already, but I think that they represent fading best in the story. They don't die the way that men do. They live forever unless they are killed. And even their death is different than men, but that's another tangent. But the elves are the firstborn of God. They come into existence in Tolkien's world before men, and they are initially the most prominent creatures. But they are fated to eventually fade within mortal lands. Their time in mortal lands is somewhat limited, or at least their power in mortal lands is. They're going to start out as being the most prominent, but in Middle-earth, they are going to eventually fall, and men are going to become the more prominent race. And that's sad to the elves who live in Middle-earth, who love Middle-earth. They have endured so much, but yet they are fated to fade, to lose their power and their prominence. And those who have been here for so long have seen so much pain and sorrow. Elrond says, I have seen 3 ages in the west of the world, and many defeats, and many fruitless victories. Galadriel says, my husband Celeborn has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I have dealt with him years uncounted, and together through ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. I think both Elrond and Galadriel in these statements sound tired. Elrond has seen many defeats, many fruitless victories. Galadriel describes her fight as the long defeat. She sees her fight as just another form of fading, that no matter how much she fights, eventually she is going to lose. She can't root out all evil. Evil is going to exist in the fallen world for as long as the world itself exists. And she can't fight the fading itself. She can't defy the plan that God has set forward forever. And so I want to talk a little bit about the rings of power themselves. And I'm a bit worried whenever I talk about the rings of power, because I've talked about them earlier in session 1, and I'm a little bit afraid that maybe I didn't use quite enough nuance whenever first discussing them, because I am afraid that, I don't know, something I say might sound contradictory because I didn't weave in enough nuance the first time, so I apologize if that's the case, but I want to talk about them a little bit. We talked about how the elves were afraid of this fading, about how they were afraid of losing their power and the prestige in Middle-earth. But they didn't want to go back home. They didn't want to go back into the West to live with the spirits who still serve God, because they didn't like the idea of giving up their power, their position. They wanted to be in control of their own lives instead of submitting themselves to the will of God. So they wanted the blessings of living under God, but without actually submitting themselves to God. And I talked about how that was the first step towards a domination mindset, that the first step in defying God, of doing great evil, is often the thought that my will and my desires is more important than the world around me. And the elves started to think that way. They didn't want to do God's will. They wanted to do their own will. And Sauron took advantage of that. He played upon their fears of losing their power and convinced them to forge magical items, these rings that would help them, that would slow the fade, that would keep them in power and prestige without having to submit to God. And so the elves agreed to this. But even though they were mistaken in their thinking, they were kind of selfish in their thinking, to them the rings of power weren't intended to be weapons. They weren't intended to be things used for conquest, for conquering other people. To Sauron, the forging of the rings was always about domination. But even though the elves had a mistaken idea by trying to defy the will of God, by not being willing to submit to God's will, they weren't as far along as Sauron. They weren't trying to forge weapons of war. So Sauron starts out forging the rings of power with the elves, and he helps them. But he also corrupts the rings. He puts some of his power into the rings that he helps make, and he makes it where those rings are going to corrupt whoever has them. They are going to turn whatever their power is used for towards evil, towards domination, towards selfish possession. They are going to corrupt you in a similar way to the way we see the One Ring corrupting people. And so Sauron has corrupted those. But then Sauron leaves to go forge the One Ring. And while he's gone, some of the elves get together and they say, hey, I think we've got this process down. Let's forge some more rings. So without Sauron present, they forge 3 more rings. The rings that would go to the elves and stay with the elves. The 3 elven rings from the ring poem. And these rings were made using the same techniques as the One Ring and the Rings of Power. And so they can still be controlled and manipulated by the One Ring. But Sauron himself never touched the 3 rings. He never corrupted them. So these 3 rings are not inherently evil the way that the other rings are. They remain tools. They can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. And I have no idea how the Rings of Power show is going to play out, or with the forging of all of the rings. I have a couple of theories, one of which is just that they're going to ignore the source material, but I don't know how it's going to play out, but that's kind of how it played out in the books. And so because the 3 rings are just tools, they don't corrupt the bearers, they are a bit more safe. Whenever Sauron is defeated and the One Ring is lost, the elves realize that, hey, because the One Ring is gone, nobody can use it to manipulate the 3 rings. So maybe we can use the 3 rings in subtle ways to try to do good. And so the 3 rings are used sometimes by their bearers, but they try to use it more subtly and more responsibly than they originally planned to. And so for a long time, the 3 rings are hidden from Sauron. They're still at work in subtle ways. In the Council of Elrond, a discussion about those 3 rings comes up. The 3 were not made by Sauron, nor did he ever touch them, but of them it is not permitted to speak. So much only in this hour of doubt I may now say, they are not idle. But they were not made as weapons of war or conquest. That is not their power. Those who made them did not desire strength or domination or hoarded wealth, but understanding, making, and healing, to preserve all things unstained. Pause for a second. This is where I worry that I didn't put enough nuance into the first session, because I tried to hammer home the mistake in the elves' ideas whenever they forged the rings. Their mistake was that they wanted the blessings of God without submitting themselves to God, that they wanted to go outside of God's plan. And so that was a mistake, and Sauron used it to manipulate them. But they were still trying to build tools through the rings that weren't for conquest or domination. Sauron corrupted most of them towards conquest and domination, but that was not what the elves originally planned. They wanted to stop the fading, keep the world the way that it was. And so Elrond is saying that the 3 rings aren't a lot of use in war. We can't use them to overthrow Sauron because they weren't made to do that. Whenever Sauron left and the elves were left to themselves, they built something that was better, not quite as evil as the other rings. These things the elves of Middle-earth have in some measure gained, though with sorrow. But all that has been wrought by those who wield the 3 will turn to their undoing, and their minds and hearts will become revealed to Sauron if he regains the 1. It would be better if the 3 had never been. That is his purpose. But what then would happen if the ruling ring were destroyed, as you counsel? Asked Loin. One of the dwarves asked, okay, so what happens to the three rings if we destroy the ruling ring? If we destroy the one ring, what happens to the others? We know not for certain, answered Elrond sadly. Some hope that the three rings which Sauron has never touched would then become free, and their rulers might heal the hurts of the world that he has wrought. But maybe when the one has gone, the three will fail, and many fair things will fade and be forgotten. That is my belief. Yet all the elves are willing to endure this chance, said Glorfindel, if by it the power of Sauron may be broken, and the fear of his dominion be taken away forever. So Elrond says, we don't know for sure, but I suspect that if the one ring is destroyed, then the power of all the rings is going to fade, that it's all going to be broken. And when that happens, a lot of the good things that the elves have used the three rings for, a lot of the fair things that they have preserved are going to fade and fall. Later, Galadriel also talks about the three rings. Do you not see now wherefore your coming is to us as the footsteps of doom? For if you fail, then we are laid bare to the enemy. Yet if you succeed, then our power is diminished, and Lothlorien will fade, and the times of tide will sweep it away. We must depart into the west, or dwindle to a rustic folk of dell and cave, slowly to forget and to be forgotten. Galadriel has one of the three elven rings, and she has been using it to try to resist the fading. She has used it to keep Lothlorien safe and to keep it beautiful and to keep her people from losing their power. But she says now there are two options. Either Sauron gets the one ring back, in which case me and everything I've used the ring that I have to make will come under his power. So my people will be destroyed if that happens. But if you destroy the one ring, then the power of all the rings is going to be destroyed. Elrond said he didn't know, but Galadriel is speaking much more certainly. She's saying, if you destroy the one ring, then the ring that I have will lose its power too. And once that happens, once the elves lose what little power they have through the rings, then we're not going to be able to hold off the fading. Most of what power we have left will be gone at that point. And so we can either stay here and fade into irrelevance, or we can leave Middle-earth whenever that happens. So no matter what, this story is going to end with either the destruction or the ultimate fading of the elves. And I think, as a side note, I think that this is why it's really great that Frodo offers her the ring. It's really a moment of character development for Galadriel, depending on what characterization you believe best fits her. But I really like the version where she is always well-meaning, but she's headstrong and she wants power and she wants influence whenever she first comes to Middle-earth. And she has been resisting giving up her own power, that she has wanted to stop the fading, that even though she wants good things, she wants to accomplish it by her own power. And so whenever Frodo offers her the ring, he offers her a third option. He offers her the chance to replace Sauron, to have the ring and always have its power, to be able to permanently stop the fading of the elves. But she says no. She has grown over her time in Middle-earth, and she has finally come to a point where she can give up power, where she can finally say, no, I would rather go into the West. I would rather give up my own will and submit myself to God's will than to take this ring and become like Sauron. And so, to the elves, no matter what happens though, this story is going to end in sadness. It just depends on how much sadness, whether they're going to be killed and enslaved by Sauron, or whether they're going to have to leave. And of course, the One Ring is destroyed, and the Three Rings lose their power, and the elves lose a lot of their power as a result. And so now, most of them decide to depart. They decide to leave Middle-earth and go back into the West. And so there is something beautiful that has been lost even in victory. Even though Sauron has been defeated, the beauty and the magic of the elves is leaving the mortal realm. It had already been fading. Many elves over the years had started taking ships back into the West. But with the destruction of the One Ring and the fading of the Three Rings, that fate is sealed. That's what the leaders of the elves are going to do. And the last line of the last section of the Silmarillion says, "And to the firstborn, the elves, the world grew old and gray. In that time, the last of the Noldor," again, the elves, "set sail from the havens and left Middle-earth forever. And latest of all the keepers of the Three Rings rode to the sea, and Master Elrond took there the ship that Círdan had made ready. In the twilight of autumn it sailed out. It passed into the ancient West, and an end was come for the Eldar of story and song." So that uses some very specific nouns, but the Noldor and the Eldar are basically the elves that we have been following all throughout Tolkien's history. They are the primary elves. In The Lord of the Rings, they are the most significant elves, the leaders, Elrond and Galadriel. And if you read the Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings, these are the elves whose stories you have been following throughout the entire work. And for them, the world grew old and gray, and they left the world, and an end was come to their story. Their story ended. There are still a couple of elves lingering still in Middle-earth. Elves, different types of elves than these. But the elves that we've been following have left the mortal world forever. And so I find this a really bitter, sweet ending to the Silmarillion. Yes, evil has been defeated. Yes, darkness has been destroyed. But something beautiful has been lost. Something beautiful has been removed from the world of men. The people that we have been following for in-universe thousands of years are gone. And they've taken their knowledge and their wisdom and their understanding with them. So even when good triumphs, something has been lost. Something irreversibly has been taken from the world. And that's one reason why last week I talked about the scouring of the Shire. I talked about how this was cut from the movies. And again, I understand why. The movies are already long, and also movies have more of a set structure than novels. But in the novel, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, they come back to the Shire, and they have found that some of the men who allied themselves with Sauron and Saruman have been causing trouble in the Shire under orders from Saruman. They have started destroying the Shire's natural beauty. They have started taking its resources. They have started to destroy it. And the hobbits have a strong reaction to coming back and seeing their beautiful home damaged in this way. "This is worse than Mordor," said Sam. "Much worse in a way. It comes home to you, as they say, because you remember it before it was all ruined. Yes, this is Mordor, said Frodo, just one of its works. Even after Sauron has fallen, even after the One Ring has been destroyed, there is still damage done. There is still beauty that has been lost. Whenever Saruman is confronted about what he has done, as I pointed out last week, he becomes a petty, little pathetic man, and he taunts the hobbits. It would have been a sharper lesson if only you had given me a little more time and more men. Still, I have already done much that you will find it hard to mend or undo in your lives, and it will be pleasant to think of that and set it against my injuries. One of the things that this section that was cut, understandably, from the films was that even in victory, something is lost. And it's not something far away in lands and kingdoms far from home. No, it comes back. You return, and something personal, something that you remember, has faded and been lost. Beauty has left the world. So why all this fading? Why in Tolkien's world do societies fade? Why are the greatest societies and the greatest achievements in architecture and the greatest feats done way in the past, in the early days of the world? Why do the elves fade and their beauty leave the world? Why does destruction enter into stories even whenever good is victorious? I think it comes back to the idea of exile. Tolkien writes, Genesis is separated by we do not know how many sad exiled generations from the fall, but certainly there was an Eden on this very unhappy earth. We all long for it, and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature, at its best and least corrupted, its gentlest and most humane, is still soaked with the sense of exile. The elves, whenever they're building their societies in Middle-earth, they are longing for and trying to recreate a past. They are reaching for something in their past, for the bliss and peace that they knew in the West. The dwarves are trying to recreate the bliss and the peace of Khazad-dûm. Men are trying to recreate the peace of Númenor in its early days, its wisdom in its early days. They are reaching back, but what they build now isn't as good as what they had. And so you can take this as, I don't know, old man yelling at cloud that it was better back in my day. But I don't take it that way. I take it as much deeper. I think that the idea of fading is so prevalent because there's something in our past that we have lost. All the societies I've talked about, they are reaching back for a paradise that they have lost, but we have our own paradise that we have lost. We were in Eden, not personally, but as a race, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. We had perfect communion with God. We had peace, bliss, and a perfect connection with God, untainted by sin. But we have lost that. That beauty has faded and left the world, and now we are living in a fallen world. And so just like we have something in our past that we long for, some part of us wants to get back to that, wants to recapture that perfect relationship with God. But we're not, and we're not going to in this life. In the same way that men are not going to recapture the glory of Númenor. something in the past was better than how it is now. And in this life, it doesn't matter how good we are, we're not going to get back to it. The good news is that Jesus offers us a way to reconnect with God. He offers us a chance to have our exile ended. If we accept Jesus Christ as Savior, we can regain that connection with God. And while we are still sinful and fallen in this life, He will one day make us pure and clean. Isaiah 59:2 is directed at the Israelites specifically, but it applies to us all. But your iniquities have separated you from God. Your sins have hidden His face from you so that He will not hear. That's the state of us whenever we come into this world because of sin. In our ancient past, there was peace. There was a perfect connection with God. But now we're separated. But we don't have to be. Jesus offers us a way to come back to God, to end our exile. Now, just because things aren't perfect in this life, just because we're not going to have that perfect, untainted relationship with God, free of sin in this life, while we are living in this body, that doesn't mean that we should just sit down and do nothing, that we can just abandon all of our duties and responsibilities. No, we have a responsibility to show the world the love and the care of Christ. And so we have a job to do, even amidst the sorrow and the fading. And the hobbits had a job to do even after the ring was destroyed, even after the men who were destroying their land were kicked out and defeated. The hobbits had to come together and they had to work to heal the Shire, to try to rebuild their society. And some good came out of this. The hobbits, honestly, at the beginning of the book, hobbits in general could be a little petty. They could be a little petty towards each other. They would be a little catty. But after they've suffered a shared tragedy, they come together as a community and they work together to rebuild the Shire, to undo some of the damage that has been caused to it. And so they grow closer as a community. And they grow more understanding of each other. And so that's going to lead into our third and final point. In Tolkien's world, joy and sorrow are intertwined. Going back to that quote from Aragorn, whenever he is going to tell a story to the hobbits to distract them from their current worries, Aragorn says, "It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts." The story that he's talking about is the story of Beren and Luthien. And I think that I've covered that in both of the online-only sections. I think the first one I cover the main story of Beren and Luthien, and then in the other online section in about sacrifice, I talk about how Galadriel's brother was involved in that story. But that's the story that Aragorn is going to tell. And I'm not going to retell it now. If you want to, you can go back to those online-only sections. But that's what he's going to tell them. And in the Silmarillion, the section on Beren and Luthien is introduced in the following way. Among the tales of sorrow and of ruin that come down to us, from the darkness of those days, there are yet some in which amid weeping there is joy, and under the shadow of death light that endures. And of these histories most fair still in the ears of the elves is the tale of Beren and Luthien. And so Aragorn is saying this is a sad tale. Silmarillion says this is a tale of joy amid weeping. These might seem like contradictory statements, but they're not. The story of Beren and Luthien is a sad tale. How sad? Well, Luthien had a canine companion, as pictured there. She had a dog friend, and the dog dies. Spoiler alert. It's so sad that they killed off a dog in that story. They also kill off like elves and men in that story, but elves and men are dying all the time in the Silmarillion. This is the only story where a dog dies that I can remember. And so it's a sad story, but it's not just sad. Those two statements are simultaneously true. They're not contradictory, because even though the story contained great sorrow in it, there is also great joy from it. And that is true of so many of Tolkien's stories. They are filled with both sorrow and joy. I want to go back to the creation story of Middle-earth. I want to explore something that God said to Morgoth, to the spirit who introduced the disruption into the music that would go on to create the world. Then God spoke, and he said, "Mighty are my spirits, and mightiest among them is Morgoth. But that he may know, and all the spirits, that I am God, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done." He says, mighty are the spirits I've made, and Morgoth's the strongest of all of you. But so you know that I'm more powerful. You know that I am God. I am going to take the music and I am going to make it a reality. I am going to give it physical form. And thou, Morgoth, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. God says, oh, and by the way, Morgoth, you tried to take over the song. You tried to be in control. You introduced bad things in the world. And you tried to do it in spite of me. But you can't beat me. I am going to take those things that you have put into the world. I'm going to take them, the things that you thought you were doing to spite me, to rebel against me, and I am going to use them for my purpose. I am going to use them to bring about beauty that you could not even imagine. I am going to use the things that you meant for evil to create a world that is more beautiful. Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Morgoth, will discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and will perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory. God goes on and says, yes, the parts that you added to the song are going to be included in the world. And Morgoth, you're going to see that in the end, the stuff that you added is only going to increase the glory of my creation. It is only going to come back and glorify me further. And we actually get a description of one of the ways that God is going to use Morgoth's rebellion to make a more beautiful world. God takes one of the spirits, a spirit named Ulmo, and Ulmo is the spirit who kind of introduces the part of the music that ends up becoming water and the sea. And God says, Seest thou now not how here in this little realm, in the deeps of time, Morgoth has made war upon thy province? He hath bethought him of bitter cold immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of the fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow, and the cunning work of frost. God says, Morgoth introduced cold to the world, like freezing cold to kill and destroy. But I'm going to take the freezing cold that he has introduced and combine it with your idea of water. And I'm going to make snow and frost and add to the beauty of it. And I don't know about you, but I love snow. I think that snowy landscapes are beautiful. At least until, the snow starts to melt and gets all muddy, then it's kind of ugly. But whenever that snowfall is fresh and clean, I think that that's one of the most beautiful things in the world. And God in this story says he tried to introduce cold to destroy your creation, to hurt your creation, but I am going to use it to make your creation more beautiful. Morgoth hath devised heats and fire without restraint, and hath not dried up thy desire, nor utterly quelled the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds, and the ever-changing mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. God says Morgoth introduced fire and heat, but he hasn't managed to dry up all the water. No, instead I have taken this thing that he meant for evil, and instead I have used it to create weather and rain. And then Ulmos, the spirit who first introduced the idea of water to the music, answered, Truly, water is become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain. Ulmos says, yes, I never imagined snow. I never imagined rain or how beautiful they could be. But you have taken what Morgoth has added, what Morgoth thought he was doing in spite of you, and instead you have worked it to bring about more beauty and more glory. And it's a common theme in The Lord of the Rings that evil ends up hurting itself. At one point, Theoden remarks, Strange powers have our enemies, and strange weaknesses, said Theoden. But it has long been said, oft evil will shall evil mar. It says evil intent, evil will, ends up hurting evil. Evil hurts itself. That many times is seen, said Gandalf. And we see it throughout The Lord of the Rings. Saruman ends up confusing Sauron because Saruman captures Merry and Pippin, and Saruman wants the ring for himself. Sauron hears that Saruman has captured two hobbits, and suddenly his attention is all on Isengard, and he's no longer focused on where Frodo and the ring actually are. Gollum tries to steal the ring from Frodo, but ends up destroying the ring, ends up destroying Sauron. Those are some of the big examples, but there are so many times in Tolkien's mythology where evil comes back and ends up hurting itself. All we do know, Tolkien writes, and that to a large extent by direct experiences, is that evil labors with vast power and perpetual success in vain, preparing always only the soil for unexpected good to sprout in. So it is in general, and so it is in our own lives. Tolkien wrote this in a letter to his son during World War II. And in that letter, Tolkien is talking about how it hurts him to see the pain and the destruction of the war, and just how much sorrow has been added to the world. But then he has this hopeful statement that evil labors with vast power and perpetual success, Evil has so much success in our world, and it's always going to as long as our world exists in its current state. It reminds me of Galadriel's description of fighting the long defeat. Evil is going to have perpetual success, but it's all going to be in vain. And evil prepares always the soil for unexpected good. So many times, terrible situations can occur. Sorrow can overwhelm us. But God can take those situations and turn them to ultimate good. And the example that I always think about in the Bible is the example of Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery. Potiphar's wife lied about Joseph and had him thrown into prison. But then God used that situation, and he raised Joseph up and made him second in command of Egypt. And then whenever his family comes to Egypt, because there is a famine, Joseph is in a position to either help or destroy them. And Joseph says of their selling him into slavery, he says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph says, you meant this for evil, but God used it for good. And then going back to our first point, Joseph comforted them and spoke kindly to them. He didn't let his pain and mistreatment make him bitter. He turned it to empathy, towards understanding and pity. And he was able to save his people as a result. And so God can turn evil to good. He can take evil and bring about good outcomes that were unintended by the evil. But there's a very important thing to remember. I've talked before about how the elves decided to rebel against the spirits who served God, or at least some of the elves, and how they were led by Feanor. And Feanor stole ships to take his people back to Middle-earth. And this is actually a picture of Feanor burning those ships after they get to Middle-earth. Once they get there, he burns the ships so nobody can go back and either get people who will resist his leadership or just abandon him. He's leaving them no option but to follow him now that they can't get back across the sea, because now he's burned the ships, so now they're stuck in Middle-earth. But before that, a messenger came from the spirits saying, hey, this is a bad idea. You need to come back, apologize for the evils that you've done and receive our pardon. And Feanor says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go back to Middle-earth, and I'm going to do great things, build great kingdoms, and I'm going to do things that will be legendary, that will be the things of story, that they will make books and songs about me. And so the messenger goes back to the spirits and reports what Feanor said. And one of the spirits has the following reaction. So shall it be. Dear bought those songs shall be accounted, and yet shall be well bought, for the price could be no other. Thus even as God spoke to us shall beauty not before conceived be brought into the world, and yet evil yet be good to have been. One of the spirits says, okay, he wants to go off and do things that are worthy of song. Okay, you can do that. He's going to suffer. His people are going to suffer for this, but maybe this is one of the things that God was talking about whenever he said that he'd bring beauty out of evil. Maybe by going off and doing these things, Feanor is going to add beauty to the world, of the stories and songs that even though they are going to be bought with sadness and death, that maybe this is part of what God was talking about bringing beauty out of sorrowful things. And I think there's a strange little meta commentary going on, because the stories of the elves are sad and filled with death and loss. But yet, I find these stories beautiful and meaningful. So, to me, yes, something beautiful has been made out of something sad. But that spirit says, okay, so maybe this is what God was talking about, bring beauty out of evil. But then one of the other spirits reminds him, and yet remain evil. He says, okay, yes, maybe some good can come of this, but you've got to remember that doesn't change the fact that it is evil. It doesn't suddenly make the bad things no longer bad just because God works them to good. Evil is still evil. And so, yes, sometimes in our lives God can work bad things to good, but that doesn't mean that sin becomes magically good. And then there are times whenever it doesn't look like evil has been used to bring about good. We don't see any obvious signs that God has taken evil and turned it towards a greater purpose. We don't always see moments like the story of Joseph, where we get a big ending where he says, what you meant for evil, God used for good. A lot of the times in our lives, we don't get that moment. We don't get to see a direct result of evil be something positive. But I still want to explore the idea of joy and sorrow being intertwined, because in Tolkien's writings there's a deeper level of entanglement between the two ideas. It doesn't just stop at sometimes God can do good things even out of bad situations. Like, that's the most obvious version of it. But it goes so much deeper. And I think that it is encapsulated in this quote by one of the elves of Lothlorien in the Fellowship of the Ring. The world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places. But still there is much that is fair, and though in all lands love is now mingled with grief, it grows, perhaps the greater. Love is mingled with grief. Sorrow exists everywhere. In all lands. You don't have anywhere that just has love. It has to also have sorrow, because we live in a fallen world, and as a result of our fall, sorrow and pain exist in the world. But the sorrow and the grief doesn't destroy the love. No, the love still grows. And not only grows, it grows perhaps the greater. In Tolkien's world, joy and sorrow are not complete opposites. We like to think of them as complete opposites in our human mind. But they're entangled. They are more like two sides of the same coin. And so, to explore this idea, I want to read a passage that comes near the end of the story that explores emotions, strong emotions of sorrow and of joy. This comes whenever Sam wakes up after the destruction of the ring. Sam thought he was going to die, but now he has been rescued, and now he finds Gandalf looking over him. And Gandalf, last time Sam saw him, Gandalf was falling into the pit of Moria. Sam was under the impression that Gandalf died and didn't know that he had come back. And so this is a joyous reunion for Sam. And Sam asks, "What's happened to the world?" "A great shadow has departed," said Gandalf, and then he laughed, and the sound was like music, or like water in a parched land. And as he listened, the thought came to Sam that he had not heard laughter, the pure sound of merriment, for days upon days without count. It fell upon his ears like the joys he had ever known, but he himself burst into tears. Then as sweet rain will pass down a wind of spring, and the sun will shine out the clearer, his tears ceased, and his laughter welled up, and laughing he sprang from his bed. "How do I feel?" he cried. "Well, I don't know how to say it. I feel, he waved his arms in the air. "I feel like spring after winter, and sun on the leaves, and like trumpets and harps and all the songs I have ever heard." And then a bit later, there is a great feast for Frodo and Sam and for all the warriors who have fought in this War of the Ring. And Sam laughed aloud for sheer delight, and he stood up and cried, "Oh, great glory and splendor, and all my wishes have come true." And then he wept, and all the host laughed and wept. And in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords, and they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. So they have this feast, and a singer gets up and sings a song, and the song he is singing is about the events of the story. It is about everything that they have gone through. And the hosts, Frodo, Sam, the men who have fought, they all have this emotional outpouring where they are laughing and crying, where they are feeling pain and sorrow, but joy and delight all mixed together, and it all just comes out in this joyous outpouring, this triumphant outpouring of emotions. And I think that the way he describes this is beautiful. And I have to ask, do you think that they would have this enormous outpouring of emotion without the sorrow? If the quest to destroy the ring had been an easy one, a day's walk with no danger, would there have been this profound joy at the end of the story? If this had been a simple thing, would there have been this beautiful outpouring? I don't think that there would be. We are limited in our understanding, but strangely, sorrow can sometimes fuel joy. As I said at the beginning, we are fallen and our understanding is limited. But I think that as human beings, a lot of our understanding comes from contrast. And a lot of what makes us happy in this life makes us happy because we can compare it to the opposite, to bad times. The moments in my life where I am most happy, where I feel the most joyful, where I feel the closest to God and the closest to heaven, are not times when my sorrows and my past griefs are forgotten. No, they are times whenever those sorrows and those past griefs, those past mistakes are fresh in my mind, but God is there alongside me saying, no, I am with you. I have brought you out of that situation. And I can say, thank you, God, for bringing me out of that situation. Because I know what it is like to be lost in sin and desperate, I know how joyous it is to be saved by your grace, God. Because I have known loneliness, I can be joyous at the fellowship that I have surrounded myself with, that you have brought into my life, God. Because of the pain that I have experienced in the past, I am now more joyous, and my life now with Christ is more beautiful. And so I know what it is like to pass into regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness, because God has brought me into that. Out of sorrow, out of pain, he has brought me to joy, and that joy is made all the sweeter because I know what it is like to have darkness, to have isolation and loneliness. Having that only makes my gratitude and my joy at God's deliverance all the greater. Again, the things that I'm saying are about our life and our experiences with our fallen human minds. But without sorrow, without sad things, then so many of our experiences would not be as joyous as they are. Sin is evil. It remains evil. But it's only because of that evil that we have the gospel story. If without sin, if it wasn't necessary to save us, then Christ's sacrifice would have been meaningless. But because we have been lost, because we have been separated from God, Christ's sacrifice is not meaningless. It can bring us closer to God. And because we know what it is like to be separated from God, then our joy is made even greater by the salvation that Christ offers. None of that makes sin okay. None of that makes it good. But God brings goodness out of it. He uses it to increase our joy whenever he comes for us, whenever he saves us. I've talked before about the idea of eucatastrophe, the sudden turning of a disastrous situation to joy, to deliverance that brings tears. And I've chosen a picture that I like of the battle before the Black Gate at the end of the Return of the King, just before eucatastrophe strikes and the ring is destroyed and deliverance is brought. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien writes, "Eucatastrophe does not deny the existence of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance." He says, hey, that eucatastrophe, that sudden joyous turn in the story, it doesn't deny the possibility of sorrow and failure. No, in fact, the opposite. Sorrow has to be part of the story. It has to be a key element, because without sorrow, you can't have the joy of deliverance. Without the opposite, you can't fully understand how great the outpouring of emotion is whenever you have that turn. Eucatastrophe doesn't deny the sorrow and pain of this life, because sorrow and pain, or the possibility of them, is necessary for joy of deliverance. But what eucatastrophe does deny is universal final defeat. That is, ultimate separation from God. Eucatastrophe denies that. It denies that God can be defeated, that there is anything that God cannot overcome, or that God will not save us if we accept him. No, despite our sin, despite our separation, we are still able to be saved because God has overcome. We will not be defeated. We might face defeats in this life, but ultimately, if we follow God, we will have the joy of deliverance. It does deny universal final defeat, and insofar as the Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Again, poignant as grief. Tolkien is connecting joy and sorrow, saying that eucatastrophe, our ultimate eucatastrophe, which is our deliverance from sin by Christ, it will bring us joy that is as poignant as our grief, joy that strikes as deeply as any sorrow we have faced. That is the ultimate eucatastrophe, and any joyous turn in our stories is just a reflection of the joy that is coming. I'm going to switch to a different author, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien knew each other, and they didn't see eye to eye on every single thing, but I think the way that they talk about this particular issue is similar. And so in The Great Divorce, Lewis writes, "That is what mortals misunderstand. They say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. And of some sinful pleasure they say, let me have but this and I'll take the consequences, little dreaming how damnation will spread back and back into their past and contaminate the pleasures of the sin. Both processes begin even before death. The good man's past begins to change so that his forgiven sins and remembered sorrows take on the quality of heaven. The bad man's past already conforms to his badness and is filled only with dreariness. And that is why the blessed will say, we have never lived anywhere except in heaven, and the lost, we were always in hell, and both will speak truly." Lewis says, some people say, how can any future comfort, how can heaven ever make up for the pain of this life? But Lewis says, no, God will one day turn those sorrows and those pains into something beautiful, into something joyous. They will be fuel for the joy that God will bring. Whenever talking about past loneliness, whenever talking about past sorrows and griefs, I have seen in my own life what Lewis is talking about here. During the time that I was going through them, they were awful. But now looking back, I see heaven. I see God working even then. I see the contrast. I can say I was in such an awful situation, but now, God, you have worked backwards and turned that sorrow into joy. You have used it to fuel the joy of my deliverance, the joy of the eucatastrophe that you have provided to me. Going back to J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien says, "And I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible, and produces that essential emotion, Christian joy, which produces tears, because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled, as selfishness and altruism are lost in love." Tolkien says that the joy of eucatastrophe is so similar to sorrow, because it comes from a place where joy and sorrow are as one, where everything else falls away, where all of our small little human attributes fall away and are lost in the love and the overwhelming love of Christ. And so even sorrow can be used by God. All sorrow, not just the ones that lead to positive outcomes, but God will even take the small sorrows, the little sorrows, and He will turn them to joy. Very truly, I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. Jesus doesn't say, I'm going to make you forget your joy. Forget your sorrow. I'm going to mind wipe you. You're going to forget about it. No, He says He's going to turn your grief to joy. The pain, the sorrow, the isolation, the inferiority that you feel, I am going to take that, and one day it is going to be turned to joy. It is going to feel your joy. You know what it is like to be separated from me. And so now, because we know what it is like to be without God, how much more grateful should we be to know Him? And so that is why I love Tolkien's writings. It's one of the many reasons, but Tolkien's world is filled with sorrow. It is filled with sad stories. The fading, the idea of fading, of beauty being lost irreversibly in this life. The idea that there is something in the past, and no matter how hard we work, we will never be able to obtain that by our own strength in this life, paints all the stories of Middle-earth as a tragedy in a way. It's all sad. There's always something lost. Beauty and magic are fading from the world, and there's nothing that can be done about them. That is what is going to happen. And the fading process makes everything feel sad, makes the whole history feel like a long defeat. But there's a reverse side to that. Because everything is tainted by sadness and sorrow, because everything is fading and beauty is being lost, and there is grief associated with that loss, there are so many opportunities for characters to grow, to learn pity, to learn mercy and empathy. And as I've been talking about for probably far too long, everything in Middle-earth is tainted by sadness. But that just means that whenever the joyous moments come, whenever the beautiful moments arrive, they are so much stronger than anything else. That sorrowful pain is then turned and fueled into joy. That tears can be the very wine of blessedness whenever joy and sorrow run together. So yes, it can be a sad story looking at all of Middle-earth's history. It can be one filled with sorrow and pain, but it is also one that is beautiful and joyous, and those two things are not contradictory. They are complementary, and the same is true of our life. Yes, our lives are sad on this earth. All of us will experience sorrow. All of us will experience pain. But God can still use that. He will still use that. He will use it to bring about greater glory for Himself. He will use it to teach us if we only listen to Him. And He will turn it to joy. He won't let us forget. He doesn't just make us forget about our grief. He turns it to joy. And so that is is beautiful to me. And I think that to me, no other story I've experienced expresses that idea, that beautiful, wonderful idea that brings joy to me, that brings tears of happiness to me. I've never experienced another story that strikes me quite this way. And so that is why, as Gandalf is getting ready to leave, he is able to say, "Well, here at last, dear friends, on the shores of the sea comes the end of our fellowship in Middle-earth. Go in peace. I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are in evil." Sorrow is not the end of the story. Sorrow is not the ultimate destination. Sometimes tears can be the very wine of blessedness. Sometimes the tears come because we have experienced something that is meaningful. Sometimes they come because Christ has saved us from sin and death and turned our sorrow to joy. So I know that this has been a long session. I thank you for sticking with me, both today and through all the other sessions. I'm very grateful that you've let me ramble for so long. I hope that you have enjoyed this lesson series, that you have found it interesting, and that somewhere along the way something meaningful has been said. And so I just want to encourage you one last time. You might be going through the darkest pits of Mordor right now in your own personal life. I don't know. But you are not alone. God is with you, and he can use even the smallest individual, the seemingly weakest person, to do his will. And no matter what you are going through, he will be there to comfort you, to show you pity and mercy. And it may not feel like it now, but one day, if you follow Christ, he will take all of your sorrow and all of your pain and use it to bring you joy in his presence, as all of our silly little human qualities fade away in the brilliance of Christ's love and glory. Thank you.